Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Hannah. If you're new here, hi, hello. We talk about books, chronic illness and life in Amsterdam, and if you're returning, then it's lovely to see you. Doing a bit of a different video today, but I hope this will start with a series. I have been putting off making videos like this because I am so indecisive, but I get a lot of DMs and messages from people, often comments asking me, where should I start with this? What's the best book you recommend for this? And like people wanting to maybe get back into reading or switch their genres or really just experiment, I guess, with their reading taste. So this is, I'm not going to call it my top 10 because that makes me nervous that I can't change my mind, and I reserve the right to revoke any of the books from this list and add others, but this is 10 books to start if you're looking to read more literary fiction, I guess. And if you're already a seasoned literary fiction reader, and especially if you're a long-time viewer of the channel, I'm sure lots of these books will be recognisable to you, but perhaps you'll just like to hear me ramble, or these are the final push you need to pick up some of these books. And I know some of you, like especially my friends on here and long-time watchers, might comment and say, Hannah, why didn't you include this book? What about this book? And if you've asked that question, don't worry, I've also asked that question in my brain, but I am gonna keep going with this series, and particularly if you think like, oh, there's not many literary romances, or there's not many books about families because I want to make a family saga video, or romps, like this is more general. And the thing about literary fiction is like it is such a generalized category of books, and everyone has their own interpretation of what makes up literary fiction, and you don't really walk into Waterstones and see this is the literary genre. Like everyone has their own interpretation and their own reasons for what makes a book literary. And I think after being a reader for a number of years and consuming, at this point, hundreds of literary fiction books, I know for myself what feels literary, and I can sense in my taste when I read something that feels perhaps a little bit more commercial or a little bit too romance, and I can find my sweet spot in those things. But you won't find that for yourself until you start reading these kinds of books, I think, because reading is subjective, we know that, but particularly writing style and authorial voice is so personal to what you enjoy. And even for me, I can enjoy a writer's tone one day, and I know if I read that book on a different month or in a different year or in a different place in my life, I probably wouldn't feel the same. So that is to say, these are literary books that I've loved that I think you might love too. I've kind of gone for a span of different types of literary books or different authorial choices that I feel represent the span of literary books that I read. But for me, a literary fiction novel focuses on character. It has well developed, well fleshed out characters that can walk off the page. It has a strong authorial voice that feels distinct and personal and recognizable. It often, but not always, plays with different devices, different sort of representations of sentences on the page, and in a sentence by sentence structure, it's beautiful to read. That doesn't necessarily mean that literary fiction is all floral, but it has a distinct voice that's recognized sentence by sentence, and that feels sort of a cut above perhaps a standard commercial fiction book that focuses on taking the reader from point A to B. It's very linear. They also play here often with sort of time and spatial elements and temporality, and that all impacts your reading experience. So I think it's just better if I start showing you the books. I think that might be more interesting to you than for me to talk in vague terms, so I can justify why I picked certain ones. This will come as literally no surprise to anyone, although I haven't ranted and raved about Wong in a really long time, I think because I probably felt like I overdid it when I first got onto the bookish internet. This is one of my favourite books of all time. I can say that with great gusto because I have the title of this book tattooed on my arm, so I've got to love it. Wong is a queer writer from the States. He's Vietnamese American, and this is his first novel. There is a second novel on the way. He's a poet by trade, first and foremost, and has two, I think, poetry collections out now, and also has a novel that is buried, I want to say in the Norwegian forest, but I can't be sure. Him, Margaret Atwood, I think plenty of other sort of notable writers wrote pieces of literature to be buried in these time capsules that aren't going to be dug up, I think, for another 70 years. I'm going to find a link to that and put it in the description of the article about that. So Technically he's writing his third novel because one lives under the ground and we probably won't see it ever. But this was his debut, On Earth with Briefly Gorgeous. And this is a letter from a mother to a son, to a mother who is illiterate, so we realise we'll probably never read this, about his experiences moving to the States from Vietnam. So it really talks about it is auto-fictitious, which is another sort of fairly common trait in literary fiction, is authors often draw on their own experiences, which that again is not exclusive to literary fiction, but it can be quite common, particularly when you're hearing from authors from marginalised experiences who want to sort of raise the voice about a certain topic. So we follow Little Dog as he's writing this letter, coming to the States, coming of age, discovering his queerness, living in an American town and witnessing these Americanisms in front of him, violence, the opioid crisis, homophobia, and it's a story to his mother for how much he loves him, but also how much resentment and difficulty comes between them because of their history. So I'm going to read you the blurb because I feel like it will explain it a little better perhaps than me. So it says, Little Dog is in his late 20s and this letter unearths a family history that began before he was born, the epicenter of Vietnam, and serves as a doorway into the parts of his life his mother has never known. At once a witness to the fraught and undeniable love of a single mother and a son, a beautifully honest exploration of race, class and masculinity, asking questions central to the American moment, immersed as it is in addiction, violence and trauma, but undergirded by compassion and tenderness. So yeah, it's a really frank and beautiful telling of this young person's experience, but is underpinned with all this history and all this weight. So it's just deeply, deeply moving and beautiful. And like I say, he has a poet's tongue, so it really does lean into the floral descriptions that are, like I say, to me, one of the best bits about literary fiction. So there's a couple, or at least one more poet coming up that I will show you, but that's my first pick, is Ocean Vuong, On Earth with Briefly Gorgeous. Next up is Miriam Taves, who is a long-seasoned writer with a huge oeuvre of books behind her, but I picked up her most famous for you, not for the reason that it is the most famous, but I think it is the most distinctive. This is Women Talking, which has been made into a very popular movie, which I'm sure plenty of you have seen, but I think the film really did do justice to the story, but the reading experience of this is so unique. It follows a remote Mennonite community where a series of violent sexual assaults and rapes sort of happen to various members of the community, the women and children, in the middle of the night, and the men of the community in this deeply patriarchal, inward-looking society, this mini society that they've built in the rural place that they live, tell the women that it is sort of the demons, the ghosts, it's nothing to do with them, it's Satan preying on their community and they have to just get on with it. But we know that that is not the case eventually. So this is based on a real story, which is something I love in literature, and I have another example of that coming up as well, where an author will take ownership of a historical event or a notable figure and then build a story and a life around them that is fictitious, and that can make for such rich writing. And as someone who really enjoys recent history, who really likes learning about people and is a huge non-fiction reader, literary fiction that deals in the historical realities of these situations, particularly in relation to sort of communities on the margins or people on the margins of society, and highlights them in the way that this does with the Mennonite community, it can be a really sort of fruitful reading experience, and Women Talking especially does that, because this series of violent attacks happened in the 2000s and was a real thing that happened to a Mennonite community. And this is a side which is not related to you needing to know this, but I'm a huge lover of reading about sort of high demand religion and religious communities, so I knew a lot about Mennonite groups before I read this, but this really just continued to enrich and evolve my knowledge of that. And this is a really interesting, so it's told through these imagined events, the imagined response to these real events, but through the eyes of a one of the only men in the room. All these women are in a sort of loft of a barn, and they are coming together to congregate to decide what do they do. Do they leave? Do they walk away? Do they fight these men, or do they sit back and do nothing? And they are raised in a religion of pacifism and told to be quiet, and they are like non-violent communicators, but all of them have differing opinions, and we watch them sort of argue, decide, think back. But the person writing it down is the only man in the room because these women are illiterate. They cannot write or read. So he is the lone scribe of the group, which makes for a really interesting dynamic in terms of gender and power and the way that the story is told. And I know a lot of people have raised issue with Taves for even choosing to put a man in this setting, but I thought it was really interesting to see him as this conduit between the women who feel so powerful to us and who feel so strong and resilient, but it's this constant reminder that they are always below the men of the community because they lack these real life skills that they need. Some really interesting stuff in here about geography and known place, because these women, if they were to escape, they've never even seen a map before, they don't know where they are. It's just a really brilliant exploration of lots of these big themes, which I guess is, a huge part of literary fiction that I missed, is that there is this top layer of storytelling which we see in, all novels that we read in some way are telling us a story, which can be from simple to dramatic to sort of the very esoteric. But for me, literary fiction has a secondary story always going underneath, which is asking questions about society, about politics, about ethics, those big life issues, like in here about patriarchy and power, and in Ocean Vuong's book about the American dream, about xenophobia, and they bubble under the surface in a very lightly touched, without moralistic, instructive pointing. They are very nuanced, I guess, in the way they tackle these questions. So it's not to say like a commercial fiction book can't ask the big questions, and there are plenty of books, particularly like contemporary romance books and contemporary family sagas that have been written that try and tackle these big questions, particularly in relation to gender and race, but they can often feel like they are instructing the reader on what to think and do, whereas for me, a lot of my favourite literary fiction books ask more of the reader to expect, to think, to criticise, to question, without giving them all the answers. So that's definitely what happens in Women Talking. Speaking of real life historical figures, a much more recent favourite book of mine that I spoke about at the end of last year is Kick the Latch by Catherine Scanlan. This is again based on a real life person or event, because it follows, I'm going to check her name, Sonia, who is a horse trainer, and she has worked on the horse tracks in the States all her life. Again, a very patriarchal and misogynistic environment to be raised in as a woman, to deal with. And the author takes a set of transcripts, interviews from meeting her, and turns them again into this fictionalized memoir type setting. This book is told in sort of singular vignettes. You can see this is a single chapter, tracing the career and personal history of this horse trainer, and it really encapsulates the feeling, the setting, the environment that Sonia lives in. You can really smell the hay, you can feel the horses, you can feel the danger and the sort of high velocity life that she's living through the descriptions, and it feels just so palpable, I guess, which is what I enjoyed. But from a form point of view, this plays with our ideas of time, of what makes a novel, what skews our perception of genre when it does things like this. And I think it makes for a really pacey read in these short chapter vignettes, and again leaves so many questions, so much negative space, which is what I find so enjoyable and so sort of satisfying in a reading experience, because all of these books, I think, produce so many questions, and that's what sort of reading in community really brings for me when I read these books alongside someone, or I lend them to someone, or I talk to you guys about them. Like there's so much richness to get stuck into, even for a book this short. So Kick the Latch again does that really interesting thing of exploring a marginal character, a sort of lesser popular topic. Like, I do have a personal connection to horse and horse racing, but I know so many of you who read this after my recommendation don't and still said you love it. And to me, that is such a mark of a brilliant piece of fiction writing, is where it can draw me into a time and place that I had no previous relationship or even interest in. And yet I feel sort of taken by the story. So that's another merit point, I think, for Kick the Latch. Up next is Summer Water by Sarah Moss. This is a stand-in also for a couple of books by Sarah Moss. I really enjoyed Ghostwall as well, and I actually just bought the favs. Sarah Moss, again, has a sort of bigger oeuvre of writing as well, but her more recent work definitely feels like the most literary. I've read a couple of her older books and not loved them, but Summer Water is one of my favourites. It plays with genre in the way that it could be described as an interconnected set of short stories. So you follow different groups of people who are at this Scottish sort of upmarket holiday camp, holiday park with sort of little different cottages in it, and we meet each group and sort of test out their dynamics. It's very fly on the wall, feeling like, what are they talking about, what are they doing? And then individual characters from each cottage end up meeting each other at various points within the one day and night that we are watching. Sarah Moss is so good at building tension and squeezing time. She writes often books in this really short time span that take you just through a day, a few hours, that feels kind of sort of wild. If you've never read a book that doesn't use time in a linear manner that we will operate time in regularly, like to read a book of 200 pages in it only to track 24 hours feels like, how does someone have so much to say about some so short amount of time? But this book really, I think, plays with tension. She can build the biggest crescendos that have no disappointment. Like, her books really feel like that tense anxiety feeling is worth it for the payoff, because she comes up with the best endings for her stories, I think, and particularly in Summer Water. She brings drama and angst and sort of, again, open endings, question marks over our characters' morality and stories. Another thing about literary fiction, I feel, is there often isn't clear lines between good and bad characters, because that reflects reality, where we don't have good and bad people. Like, we have a lot of moral greyness everywhere, and in fact you could argue that every person has that inside of them. And I feel like that's what makes these characters, like I said earlier, so palpable, so 3D, so not like characters but in fact like real people, because they sort of mess with all these different emotions as we do as people as well. So this one is so good. It's a rainy, dark Scottish day in July. So if you are looking for a summer read that actually feels relatable, if you're living in Northern Europe at the time, then this one is for you. And she also does really good snippets of nature writing and really brings the natural environment into her storytelling in a way that feels like it is another character, like it is participating alongside these characters. So that's Summer Water. Okay, next up is two of my favourite black male writers who are both sort of millennial age-ish, like they're both sort of younger and are on their first or second books. This is Brian Washington, and I also have Caleb Azuma Nelson to talk about. Brian Washington is from the States, and this is his second book, but I would recommend both of his books, and I actually would have put Memorial in here as my first pick, I think. But it's with a friend right now. So imagine this is a stand-in for both of Brian Washington's his two novels. So this is Family Meal, and the reason why I love Brian Washington's work and feel like, to me, that he is a literary favourite is because I feel so safe in his work. And as we said, reading is subjective, and there's lots of things that people don't want to read about or feel like can be made flippant, used as plot points, or leave a bad taste in your mouth when you're reading a book that touched on something that's so deeply personal to you, but does it in a way that feels distasteful or inhumane, or just without sort of the softness that you expect. It can really be a jarring experience. And for me, Brian Washington touches on such deep and difficult topics with his characters, but he shows them such humanity, which is what I appreciate so much in his work. This and his first novel deal a lot with grief, with acceptance of your queerness and complicated family relationships, but he tells them in a really creative sort of, again, without linear narrative. His first book used a lot of mixed media and was a dual timeline, and his second book he talks really a lot in dialogue without quotation marks, a la Sally Rooney, which, by the way, obviously I think Sally Rooney is like a safe bet to put in this book, but I just felt like we've talked about her till we're blue in the face and no one needs a recommendation for normal people, so just wanted to put that out there. She is a literary fiction writer and she is someone I enjoy, and I'm looking forward to her next book. But anyway, yeah, he deals with characters and brings them so close to home, but I feel so safe and secure in his writing that I know he can tackle any topic and I won't feel like hard done by or hurt by his words. So I should probably tell you that this follows Cam, and he starts in LA. He's just lost a boyfriend to a violent accident, not even accident, a violent attack. And he moves back home, although he doesn't really have home anymore because his parents are no longer alive. So he ends up moving back in with his childhood best friend. They sort of drifted as Cam sort of acknowledged his queerness and acknowledged his unrequited love for this friend. But they moved back into TJ, his name is, and his family bakery, where Cam starts working, and they rekindle their friendship, and it sort of all moves from there. But there is, what Brian Washington I think does so well is these interpersonal relationships outside of a nuclear family, and he really explores, you know, you could call them unconventional, but they're not unconventional because people all around the world are living with these kinds of relationships all the time, but it's not sort of like traditional in a sort of white Christian sense of the nuclear family. And he really does that without tokenism and with a real care, I think, is what I love. His characters are flawed, they are complicated as a reflection of the people that we are as readers, but he really treats them with kindness in a way that makes me feel like they are real, I guess, which is kind of what I've said before. So, the other thing also, I think he writes really good sex scenes, which is a rarity when it comes to books. I'm so easily cringed out by any kind of PG-13 content in books, not because I'm a prude, but because I find them often so poorly done. But I think he writes like some really good, intimate, sexy relationships that I can get on board with. So that's Brian Washington. And the same in terms of like placeholder goes for this book. This is Black British writer Caleb Azumah Nelson. This is his second book, Small Worlds. But I actually wanted to talk to you about Open Water, which has quite a similar cover, but again, it must be on loan to a friend. If not, I'm concerned. Open Water is, and so is Small Worlds. Caleb Azumah Nelson writes a lot with rhythm and melody. He has a real infusion of music within his books, in a sense of sort of explicitly talking about music. His books are set in South London. He talks about the Black British community, and a lot of his characters are in some way involved in community music or their own projects. So he talks about it and his character's love for that, but also there is a real melody to his writing, a melodic tone that feels, particularly in his first novel, which is written in the second person, which is my second point I was going to make, is about exploring those writing styles for me in literary fiction. Doing something unconventional like that was can really draw you into a story in a way that feels like you're in a conversation or relationship or dialogue with your character, with your book, which feels really all-encompassing in a way that I really, really appreciate. But he talks a lot in rhythm and dialogue in Open Water. He does a lot of repetition and really just embraces the tones and the rhythms of the environment he's writing about, which makes it again feel so immersive, which I love. His books could be classified, I suppose, as romance, like they are. Again, he writes great, sexy, intimate, young love, sweaty London summers. Like he really embraces that that coming of age story, but because he uses all these other devices and really imbues his work with that distinct taste and flavour of Caleb Zuma Nelson, like, I can't help but think about him as a literary writer because of that. So there is so much more to come from both him and Brian Washington, and I really believe I will be lifelong readers of their work, because I just will return back to their stories. They are distinct, they have sort of trademarks that I appreciate. They deal in the same themes, but the books don't feel the same, and I really love that. So that's Caleb Zuma Nelson. This is the penultimate Black British writer to talk about. This is That Reminds Me by Derek Owusu. Derek Owusu, similar to Ocean Wong, is a poet by trade, and his work is definitely much more explicitly poetic. He plays also a lot more with on-the-page narrative style. I wanted to show you one. For example, this book is the story of a young boy, Kay, who's sent into care because of a disintegrating family relationship, and he comes back after many years to his mum and sort of tries to rebuild their a rapport with her, even though he feels so changed by the care system and she feels so changed by the grief of temporarily losing a child. But he's coming back to them at a time where his body is changing, his life is changing, he's coming of age, and he's trying to relearn sort of life in this city where his mother knows, and sort of create friendship bonds and also deal with his mental health. Derek Owusu talks really openly about his experiences as a young black British man with struggling with their mental health. I believe he's diagnosed with BPD, and he talks about that openly, and also sort of talks a lot about that in his novels in a way that, again, is light touch, is without judgment, without morality, but is so beautiful. He definitely also does not follow a linear narrative. He writes in these vignettes, these short prose chapters of a couple of pages, even sometimes just a couple of lines on a page, and builds this picture of a character in your head that feels so palpable and so within, touching distance of you as the reader, and is really sort of a character study, I suppose. Things happen in this story, but you are not following them from point A to point B. You are hearing anecdotes, descriptions, feelings, internal monologues to build a picture of a person, and that's what makes up the narrative. And so his work is so beautiful, so moving. In some ways it can be quite obtuse, I think, particularly his second novel, Losing the Plot, which is, again, much more focused on mental illness and struggle with that. But he also, I forgot to say, weaves in a lot of his own heritage, ancestral folklore and stories very lightly into these books as well, which I also really appreciate. But what I was going to say about it being obtuse is sometimes you have to work a little harder. They're the kind of books that you could read twice, back to back, cover to cover. But that working for the reward and the satisfaction of the reader to really sort of fill in the gaps of this character, I find really enjoyable, and I think it can sustain your attention when it is such a short book, and he does tend to write, I think these are under 116 pages long, so it really is a one sitting kind of novel, which I really enjoy. Speaking of one sitting novels, Musa Okwonga's In the End, It Was All About Love. I'm so blessed to now call Musa a friend, and also so thankful for him because he introduced me to one of my best friends in the city here in Amsterdam, so we love Musa. This was Musa's first novel, poetry, sort of experimental piece of fiction. These next two books are probably the most experimental. I want to show you some of the pages. This is published by an indie called Rough Trade, so it's a really super cool. These were one of a kind created covers. Everyone was different in terms of the dyeing, and this follows an unnamed narrator who is a black queer British man arriving in Berlin, which is also Musa's story and Musa's background. He left the UK and moved to Berlin I think 10 or so years ago now, and the narrator of this story is looking for love, for connection, for acceptance of his bisexuality as a young black man, and his father is no longer with him, died on prior, I think, to his 40th birthday, and our main character heads back to Uganda, where our narrator and Musa's family heritage also is, to see the grave of his dad and also try and reckon with this idea of, as he, our narrator, approached his 40th birthday, what that means to outlive your dad, what that means to relinquish control and expectations of the life you thought you would have and be able to show your parents, and talks a lot about the grief and the damage he endured to lose a parent at a young age and how difficult that is. But it has some poetry in it, some stories of different experiences. He talks a lot about racism in Europe, xenophobia, homophobia, like biphobia, that our character experiences, and the rise of the right. This book was written a few years ago now. I want to say 3 or 4, but and the situation in Germany has only proceeded to get worse in terms of racism and attacks on migrants and immigrants living there. So yeah, this is definitely has food for thought and deals with a lot of those, like I say, big life questions, societal critiques, but is beautiful, poetic, soft, gentle, and does all those things at once, and that's why I love it. So that's, in the end, it was all about love. Arguably the most experimental book in terms of prose on this list is Little Scratch by Rebecca Watson. I just saw that Rebecca Watson is writing another book, which I'm so excited about. I'll give you an example of one of the pages here. So this book again plays with temporality, because we follow one woman in the course of a day as she has to return to her place of work where she was raped by her boss, and sit through a normal working day whilst her internal mind is screaming at her. Her fight or flight is in action and she is fearful for her life. It follows on one side her external monologue and the activities that she is doing, and on the other side we see and hear her internal thoughts. So it is quite sort of a clear metaphorical representation of those experiences, and obviously deals with a deeply traumatizing and difficult topic. But it really pairs together the mundanity of office work, of day-to-day life, of Groundhog Day, with this churning of trauma and sort of violence and damage, and that feels like such a deeply relatable juxtaposition, even if you're not someone who has experienced sexual violence, but for whatever trauma you might have gone through, having to play performance of yourself in real life while managing all of those difficult feelings inside. This feels like such a hectic and chaotic and sort of frenzied day that is also deeply relatable to a lot of different kinds of survivors. So I think Rebecca Watson did such a brilliant job at this. She's also written plenty of interviews sort of about why she wrote this book and sort of how sort of flippant it feels when people ask her if the main character is her, and that's when it becomes quite complicated to talk about sort of auto-fiction and self-insert characters like we have with Derek Arusu referencing his own mental health, and Ocean Wong talking about his American Vietnamese heritage. Is that like that definitely isn't a rule for literary fiction, and it isn't always the case, and it becomes dangerous if you start to assume so. So with that being said, I think Rebecca Watson and Little Scratch, I'm really gutted I missed the play they put on of this, I think last summer or the summer before in London, but this is such a sort of complicated yet playful yet incisive look at violence against women, and it was great. Okay, come into the home stretch. Saltwater by Jessica Andrews. This, I guess, similarly to Brian Washington and Caleb Zuma Nelson, could be classed as a romance. This book does talk about relationships, and particularly her second book, which I've lost the name of right now, does that too. But Saltwater by Jessica Andrews, I think, is my favourite of hers. This is told in numbered vignettes. You can see here, and it follows the life of Lucy as she moves from Sunderland to London as a working class northerner to attend university, and then back to Ireland, where she is dealing with her alcoholic father's end of life and piecing together family history she's never heard and managing that complicated post-grad trying to find yourself as an adult in the real world feelings, but is told through this poetic, individual sort of snippets of a day, of a thought, of half of a journal entry, like very internal monologue, very focused on the self, but weaving together a lot of family history through perhaps Lucy picks up a postcard or she sees a photo for the first time or an old newspaper clipping, and we'll talk about intergenerational connection with the women who came before her. We'll talk about her connection to being a working class northerner and how that impacted her ability to self-actualise in London and sort of feel like she belonged, like she could make something of herself. So it's a very relatable story, I think, for a lot of different people and for a lot of different reasons, but it's told so beautifully with such finesse and such just such style that feels unique to Jessica Andrews that I can't help but consider it a literary favourite. Okay, finally, but certainly not least, is another brilliant female writer. This is Olivia Sudjak's Asylum Road. This is Olivia Sudjak's second novel. She wrote Sympathy, which I actually haven't read, and she also wrote a small non-fiction book similar size to this, kind of like extended essay. But this is her second novel. I need to get their names right. Anya, what was her boyfriend called? Luke. So Luke and Anya take a road trip from London to the south of France to go to a wedding. But as they are travelling on this journey, they are coming to terms with perhaps the staleness of their relationship, the questions over what they both want in life, and what looms so heavy over Anya is her escape from Sarajevo, prior to the siege of Sarajevo, where she left behind a lot of family members and sort of other childhood friends, and has built this life for herself in London, where she was doing her PhD, although she's deeply unhappy with it. And feelings come to the surface as they return from this trip and decide to sort of make a pilgrimage back to Sarajevo to find and see Anya's family and talk about what they want to do. And it comes to a head at this crushing, sort of overwhelmingly tense and difficult dinner party scene, or like family dinner in this tiny flat where Anya's mother lives back in Sarajevo, that is so palpable and just like skin crawlingly tense. Although it's not like imbued with sort of real life danger or any sort of fear of violence, it just has this real tone of sort of the weight of everything that's ever happened to your family lies at this dinner table. And Olivia Sudjak wrote that so well. Like, I recommend this book for that scene alone. I think it is so well done. Throughout the book, she has these real moments of tension, of pushing and pulling between these characters that you never really know what foot you're standing on. And I really enjoy that instability, I guess, in her writing style. There's a lot of pointed remarks, a lot of wit and sarcasm and humour. You'll actually notice that a lot of these books I haven't spoken about if they're funny or not, but I think Caleb Azuma Nelson has some humour in his books, as does Brian Washington. But a lot of these stories can be heavy and can be difficult because, like I say, they reflect society and the questions we're asking ourselves, which unfortunately can be quite difficult too. So this obviously is steeped in recent history of stories of nationhood, of xenophobia, of immigrant experience, of violence, of all of those things that come along with when we think about that time in Sarajevo. And I think this book does it so well. Olivia Sudjak's family heritage, I believe, is Serbian, if not Bosnian Serb. And so she's writing again from this point of knowledge, from this point of personal expertise and sort of, if not personal lived experience, familial lived experience. But she does it with such sort of intricate layers that feel like you just constantly, each chapter you're peeling back and back and back for another sort of moment that then contributes to the weight of that dinner scene. It's really unsettling, but also deeply clever and beautiful in places, actually reflective and emotionally fraught, but relatable in the sense of interpersonal relationships and families being so complicated. So that's the final book. I think that actually makes 11 if you've been counting, so sorry, not sorry, I didn't know which one to cut out. But I hope you enjoyed this introduction to some literary fiction books I think you might enjoy. I would love if you have any recommendations for the next 10 books you'd like to see in a series, whether that be essay collection, short stories, non-fiction books about a topic. Just let me know, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.